Hello everyone. So we are continuing with this series of lessons about Asian theologies and what they can give us when we reflect on violence and peace building in our different national contexts. Last time we started with a kind of introductory lesson about what is the biblical narrative about violence. We're going to have a second introductory lesson today, which will be about what are Asian theologies, because this is not a term we are using all the time. How to locate Asian theology in a wider context and how to approach them. Well, we know that discourses on God or on the divine have been developed by all traditions in all continents. Actually, the term theology first is a philosophical term. It appears in Plato, and Plato understands it as a philosophical purification of mythological text. So, which means you have narrative, myth, and the philosopher will think about them so as to find the divine, or at least the little part of the divine you can find about it. It is a kind of tension between narrative and reason. And this is what happens in all traditions. We have stories. Stories define our culture. No? People, when they are children, hear that kind or that kind of story. And we know that the stories speak of a reality that pure reasoning cannot approach or totally encapsulate. The reason must cross narrative so as to go beyond reason itself. Okay. But for many traditions, especially Christian tradition, but also Islamic tradition, for instance, theology is an elucidation of a revelation. So revelation is also stories, the gospel are stories, but those stories are embodied into structure in which God has given special insights about who he is. Okay? So, as I said, there is indeed a special status of Christian theologies, but the term can be extended to any attempt that refers to a canonical corpus, to classics that are invested with special authority. Till now, theologies developed in the Asian context have not met with the echo encountered by theology developed like in Latin America, for instance. But still, since at least the 1970s onward, there have been many theological developments on the Asian continent. Maybe one of the reasons for this modesty of Asian theology is that Christians are only a tiny minority of Asian population. So they are not as visible as it is the case in Latin America, for instance. Still, the situation might be changing. The universal Christian churches have been taking notice of the fact that the 21st century is indeed, now one can say, is the Asian century. Trying to capture the nature of their experience, theologians working in Asia speak and write often as a theology of harmony. Harmony is often the way, though it is not the only one, we will see it, to define Asian theology. The expression is not only a catchword, it opens up the door to a nexus of concept and approaches that we will unfold little by little. So, of course, if we want to understand Asian theology, we have to put them in a historical and cultural context. Asia and Asia Christianity can be described as an ocean of contrast, extremely underlined contrast in different contexts, still that gathered into the unifying flux of the Asian space and ethos. We can think about Saint Francis Xavier, who in the 16th century go to the Indonesian archipelago, India, Japan, and finally the coast of China. So he writes about the Moro Islands, and they say, the people of these islands are very barbarous and full of treachery. Each of these islands has a language of its own, and there is an island where almost every village has a different tongues. Okay, so for Francis Xavier, this incredible multiplicity of language is a kind of barbarity, something so hard to deal with. And so he's relieved when he goes to Japan and he can write, in all this land there is only one language, and it is not very difficult to understand. Well, Francis Xavier has certainly a gift for tongues in that case. But still, the most important fact is that the first experience of Christianity in Asia is that unbelievable diversity, starting from a diversity of tongues. So this variety of South Asian linguistic world was seen by Francis Xavier as an obstacle to evangelization, associated with savage state of the native. And the linguistic unity of China and Japan was a proof of the degree of civilization. But today, theologians will be rather prone to stress that Asian Christians offer to their respective churches the riches of their languages, 600 different languages and dialects in Indonesia, 135 in Malaysia, that associate with the one of the rituals and worldview, that somehow the Christianity of the Pentecost, every culture, every tongue, brings up something to the glory of God. But still, there is this kind of balance between the difficulty and sometimes conflicts that come from diversity and the riches that are associated with that same diversity. And we will need to understand the topic of harmony in such a contrasting context. Asia draws its resources from a variety of sources. We know that, though you can see it as a kind of space in flux. Chinese culture, which embodies Taoist, Confucianism, greater vehicle Buddhist tradition, Hinduism, lesser vehicle Buddhism, other religious expression originating from the Indian subcontinent, Islam, with Indonesia being the most populated Muslim country in the world. Of course, also indigenous beliefs and practices present all over the region, and so on and so on. So this incredible variety of religious cultures goes along the variety of languages, of tongues we have spoken about. Well, I have spoken of the 16th century, but it is just to note that Christian presence in South Asia, at least, started much before that. The Syrian church, with the help of Persian merchants, established seats in Ceylon, Burma, and the Malay archipelago. And we know that in the 6th, 17th century on, those Syrian monks went up to China. But still, it is after the 16th century, or from the 16th century on, that Asia met with Christianity on a grand scale. When it comes to Northeast Asia this time, Christianity, as it was shaped by European tradition, which is important, encountered Japan, China, and Korea from the 1550s on. But it was slow to inculturate, at least in terms of theology. The Jesuit Faculty of Theology in Shanghai, which was transferred to the Philippines in 1952, kept Latin as a teaching language until 1964. And after it shifted to English, and after that only did it shift to Chinese. Okay? It is only in 1968 that Chinese started to be a theological language developed first from Taiwan, for instance, at least for the Catholics. That will be a little earlier for the Protestants that meet also with other difficulties. Now I am going to introduce a concept that might sound a bit difficult, but it's not so difficult. And this concept is meant to help us to deal with this diversity of tongues, of cultures, and also of experiences. And this concept on which most Asian theologians would insist, I call it hermeneutic attentiveness. We need to come to terms with worldviews that are embedded into words, concept, linguistic structure. We need to remain open to the plurality of experience that are translated into languages. Though sensitivity or attentiveness needs to be tuned to the variations that will go from one language to one experience to one form of culture. To let our ear attuned as it is attuned to different forms of music, you know, and it is needed also, the same attentiveness, when we assess ever-evolving economic, social, and ecological challenges. I say ever-evolving because we see recently how much indeed situations can evolve and sometimes how quickly. Okay. Asian Christians also deal with political issues that require from them to exhibit wisdom and forbearance. For instance, sometimes they need to deal with revivalism, the way some religions try to become predominant, for instance. But revivalism can be very different in expression and so on. So be it on politics, on social and ecological concern, being on language, on differences of culture, religions, and experiences, we need all the time to make our ear go from one form of music, I will say, to another, not to stick to one musical or theological mode. Which means indeed that we have to be extremely attentive to context. Texts and words get their meaning only when they are put into context. There is a theologian, Michel de Certeau, that has noted by the mere fact of combining the word of theos and logos, theology is based upon a tension. A logos is a systematic discourse. A kairos, in which God reveals himself, is an event, a surprising event that makes us feel the coming of the living God. There is no theos without a kairos, a moment in which God appears to us. So theology is based on that tension between the moment in which we discern something of God and the discourse to which we are used to. Theology nurtures the discernment on the faith experience that believers share among them. But it must accept that the language and focus is renewed according to the way God makes himself present, continuing the narrative of the salvation history that we have seen last time in the Bible. There is another way of approaching what Asian theology is about. I just spoke about hermeneutic attentiveness. I could also speak of a style. You see, not a content, but a style. And this style can be defined as follows. It is about the optimism of the heart. Okay? The history of the apparition of the theology of harmony is first a collective endeavor. You don't speak about harmony yourself, alone, by yourself. Harmony is something which is spoken about and built by a community. One difference maybe between Asian theologies and others is that most of the time it is shaped by collective. For Catholics, the main role has been played by the Federation of Asian Bishops Conference, FABC, created in 1972, that comprises 22 national conferences from Pakistan to the Philippines, from Korea to Indonesia. And FABC has published papers that are theological and pastoral in scope that now includes 162 titles. So this is an attempt at collective theological building. So this first theological style, and I'll go slowly toward the optimism of the heart, is first built on community, speaking theologically together, not by big theologians, by heroes, but as a continental community. So the successive FABC gathering and paper have fostered a search for sharing consensus building. Okay? Consensus building has been important for building Asian theology as theology of harmony. It belongs to no one. Its process reflects the values and methods it defends. Actually, there is a beautiful sentence by Aloysius Pieris, a theologian from Sri Lanka, the Asian sense in theology. He says, the method cannot be severed from the goal. The perfection to be achieved is the style of achieving it. So what counts is not the content of the theology you develop, it is first how you do theology. How you do theology meekly, how you do theology as a community, how you do theology by consensus building and dialogue. You see, we are already speaking about violence and pill building. Sometimes there is a violent way of doing theology, trying to impose your concept of dogma on other people. And there is a meek way of doing theology, which is the sharing of this incredible variety of languages, cultures, and experiences of which I have already spoken. So dialogue can be seen as a theological path, okay? Actually, from the start, FABC has stressed this importance of dialogue. The Indian theologian Felix Wilfred has written, in our context, dialogue must come first. Since in Asia, Christians are only a small minority, we dialogue through life situations with people of other faiths. Theology of harmony is part of the discussion and reflection on theologies of dialogue. Actually, FABC often speaks of three kinds of dialogue. Dialogue with the poor of Asia, integral liberation, option for the poor. Dialogue with their cultures, inculturation. Dialogue with their religious and philosophical tradition, interreligious dialogue. So dialogue with the poor, dialogue with the culture, and interreligious dialogue are three interrelated forms of advancing on that theological path. There are many dialogical styles, of course. You can dialogue in many ways. And the dialogue in Asia is not argumentative, Raymond Panikkar, who is both an Indian and a Spanish Catalan theologian, has described the Asian dialogue this way. Dialogue seeks truth by trusting the other, just as dialectics pursues truth by trusting the order of things, the value of reason and weighs the argument. Dialectics is the optimism of reason. Dialogue is the optimism of the heart. Dialectics believes it can approach truth by relying on the objective consistency of ideas. Dialogue believes it can advance along the way to truth by relying on the subjective consistency of the dialogical partners. Dialogues does not seek primarily to be a duologue, a duet of two logoi, of two discourses, which would still be dialectical, but a dialogos, a piercing of the logos to attain a truth that transcends it. In Greek, dia means to go through. So through a dialogue, we go through reason. We go beyond reason by reaching a level of agreement that goes deeper. We do a kind of journey through our languages. So, Asianes, spirit of dialogue, quest for harmony. We are committed to the emergence of the Asianes of the Church in Asia. The Church has to be an embodiment of the Asian vision and values of life, especially interiority, harmony, holistic and inclusive approach to every area of life. This is best discovered and affirmed not in confrontation and opposition, but in the spirit of complementarity and harmony. So you see there is a way of doing theology that by itself is a kind of peace building. And for the New Asian theologians, that the only way maybe to do real theology, to go together in a quest for God. Okay. There is also a beautiful quote by an Indian theologian, Michael Amalados. A vision of harmony accepts multiple identities in the community as the gift of God for the enrichment of all. It promotes a participative democratic order to which every group has its contribution to make. It moves through consensus rather than through the domination by any one group. Dialogue is the appropriate way of promoting harmony. Any mission that is set in the context of the mission of God cannot but be dialogical. Any mission has to be dialogical. This is not a luxury, this is a requirement. So we slowly progress in the understanding of Asian theology not as a content to be memorized, but as a style, dialogical style, style of hermeneutical attentiveness. Another characteristic is the important use of symbols and narratives as a theological language. Okay? Images, metaphors, poems, story are the privileged language through which God makes himself known throughout history. This is actually already the way we went through the Bible narrative last time. There is a very beautiful book by Kosuke Koyama, that's already an old book. He was a Protestant Japanese working in northern Thailand. And he writes, while contemplating buffaloes grazing in a paddy field. He says, buffalo, mountain frogs, sticky rice, and cockfighting are realities that provide the congregation with metaphors akin to the language and insights of the Hebraic psalm. Koyama contrasts also what he called the coolness of Thai Buddhist vocabulary and approach of life with the hotness of Christian lexical register, or at least of Western Christian lexical register. Now, the book I'm speaking about is called Water Buffalo Theology. You look at God from the viewpoint maybe of a little shepherd who is leading a water buffalo. And your experience of the buffalo and of the nature in which you with the buffalo lives becomes the context in which your experience of God happens. So in that book, Kosuke Koyama writes, making hot and cool religious standpoints meet and equilibrate each other involves a lexical operation, a recapturing of the full range of vocabulary offered by separate tradition in order to warm one tradition and to cool down the other. This is what you could call cross-cultural hermeneutics. Within the biblical canon, and showing a sense of humor not foreign to the nature of his theological project, Koyama sees the Epistle of James as a good example of the use of picture words, as well as an attempt at cooling down the tongue. So here is what the Epistle of James tells us. Tongue is only a tiny part of the body, but its boasts are great. Think how small a flame can set fire to a huge forest. The tongue is a flame too. We saw that when speaking about violence in the Bible last time. The blessing and curse come out of the same mouth. My brothers, this must be wrong. Does any water supply give a flow of fresh water and salt water out of the same pipe? So our tongue should be cool already for James, a Hebrew writer. He said, your tongue is like a water pipe. You cannot let the same water pipe give harsh words and cool, meek words. Okay, so this kind of metaphor for Kosuke Koyama can meet with metaphors of South Asia, for instance, in order to create a set of metaphors that will speak of God in an appropriate language. Koyama thus advocates a humbling, a kenosis of the South Asian Christian vocabulary, a way to put the face into the earthly reality shared by the poor living on those lands. And this has been met, as I said, by FABC or by ecumenical consultation held, for instance, in Singapore already some time ago. Okay. No attempt is made to reduce the particular to an abstraction, to ready-made categories of thought. The metaphor of the tongue by James is already enough for entering into an experience of Christian experience, without putting concepts on top of it. So the theological stress has been transferred from lexical question to narrative. You use words for telling story. Religious experience is translated not first in creed and practices, but into narrative of various kind. We narrate our life and the intrusion of God in our life. Musical tales, hagiography, the story of one conversion, the enacting of certain rituals, all of these are multi-layer narrative. The creed that we say every Sunday is a narration. We tell the narration of the intervention of God in the history of humankind and where humankind is leading. The reenactment at the Last Supper in our liturgies are all narrative, and as narrative, they become a space of reflection for theology. So, the rooting of Christianity in Asia depends on the way faith-based communities are able to enact, develop, and exchange their own narrative. This is the case, for instance, in the Philippines. Jose Mario Francisco speaks about peace-building attempts in the Philippines between Christian and Islamic community. He writes, traditional religious narrative before Spanish colonization had been preserved among some tribal groups. However, due to the majority status of Christianity in the Philippines, the dominant religious narrative are those of the Christ story. Before the recent translation of the Bible into the vernaculars, the popular form of chanting and later of dramatizing the Christ story during the Holy Week has functioned like an epic in lowland communities. it makes the Christ story available as foundational narrative and enables Christians to appropriate this story as their own. Actually, Francisco goes one step further. He first tells us in this paragraph how, let's say, the official narrative of Christianity has become, through transformation and epic, a lowland community's narrative, has been popularized, has become a narrative of the Philippines. After that, he shows how peace builders organize meetings between different communities, though Islamic, or still keeping to the Aboriginal faith, or Christians, in which they exchange their tale, their narrative, they commune in stories to which they all can resonate, and that are often shaped according to the model of the stories that were existing before the Spanish colonization. So this sharing of story is both a theological endeavor and a peace-building operation. That is my point. Again, the building up of an Asian theology cannot be separated from an operation of peace-building in the different Asian contexts. So the stress put on the rooting of Christian narratives has led to a focus on the interaction between the various faiths operating in the regions. This is what I just said. If Christian communities had to be agents of peace, religious narratives were to play a role. Creative interpretation of canonical narrative can stress peace and reconciliation. In the pluralistic situation of the Philippine southern island of Mindanao, some narratives play a mediating role by incorporating elements from different religious traditions. The sharing of story, especially role model story, at the grassroots level is by itself a factor of reconciliation. But I add, as I just said, the sharing of story is also a factor of theological building. We could find other example in India, for instance, though the context of the Philippines and India is very different. So, for instance, an Indian theologian, Gonsalves, has seen God's kingdom as what he calls a counter space. God's kingdom, as we see actually in the Sermon on the Mount, subverts a set of categories through which we construct space: sacred, secular, insider, outsider, and so on. So this division don't exist in the kingdom of God. So he represents harmony itself as a communal dance, the kind of communal dance in its round form, which is done in a village. The communal dance does not separate performers from audience. The village dance is life reenacted in dance, and life is a dance in solidarity and communion. So this metaphor extends to a contemplation of the Trinitarian movement. The dynamism of the dance evokes a plurality of manifestation that merge into one movement. Trinity, for this Indian theologian, Trinity is a dance. So metaphors grounded into life experience open up the parabolic space in which human and divine realities commune. So the same thing could be said, of course, for North Asia. I have spoken mainly about Southeast Asia or South Asia till now with the Philippines and India. We know how difficult it was for missionaries to deal with linguistic problems in China, in Korea, in Japan. They were given permission to use vernacular language, but they were very, very slow to use it. The authoritative source of Catholicism, for speaking of Catholicism, were controlled by the use of Latin till the middle of the 20th century. Well, for Protestant missionaries, they started later, around 1800, and in one century, they made incredible translation endeavor in Japanese and Chinese, especially. And later on, they did more well-polished translation. The same thing can be seen in Korea, but with many difficulties, actually. After 1916, new publications appeared based on renewed scholarship. The first complete Chinese Catholic Bible was published in 1967 in Taiwan. In Korea, the Bible was newly translated for common use by both Catholic and Protestant. New Testament in 1971, Old Testament in 1977. And the Catholic Bible in Korea was completed in 2002. This is a way to say that till now, we are still dealing with the problem of language, how to deal with different language, communicate it, and let God communicate with us in our own languages. Contextual biblical hermeneutics emerged from this translation enterprise. And this is also the way Bible had to meet with classics, especially Chinese classics, as it was finding its language. Okay? Classical commentaries do not simply use logic. They let the reader take into account its subjective experience. This is what Bible translation had to do in North Asia when trying to find an appropriate language by looking at the language developed by classics and commentaries in China. That is a bit the lingua franca of North Asia, at least the textual language throughout history. Giving its full importance to the variety of linguistic apprehension of the word, recalling stories of hardship, trauma, forgiveness, survival, and hopes that shaped Asian nations and their Christian communities, being attentive to the style of storytelling. You count it, no? I am the one counting it?
Yeah, you count it.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So let us recapitulate what we said today. First, it is important to give its full significance to the variety of linguistic variety in Asia. And we have seen how important it is. We speak in our language. We have at the same time, with our hermeneutic attentiveness, to recall and appreciate stories of hardships or salvation that have shaped both Asian nations and the Christian community that live in it. We have to make a kind of reenactment of the stories that are found in various Asian cultures and somehow to build a common narrative among or from all those different narratives. And this attention to language, to stories, to experiences, the way we build up story, we build up both a narrative of peace building and a theological narrative. All of this contributes to this encounter between the Christian faith and various religious East Asian narrative. This is exactly the task we are engaged into. So I would say that Asian theology is a bit dismissive of concept as concepts. It insists on the fact that words and concepts take meaning, take blood and flesh within the flow of a story which is told in many tongues and in very concrete way from the water buffalo. Still, there is a last point I have to note, and this last point we already prepared what we will say in the next lessons. The idea of Asian theologies itself has been challenged. And notably, it has been challenged by some Asian feminist theologies. They say that Asianness, or the importance of nation or ethnic group, and so on, is a kind of Orientalism, even if it is a kind of counter-Orientalism. Why? Because it essentializes group. Asia becomes an essence. Chinese culture becomes an essence. My ethnic identity becomes an essence. And many essences or essentialization were against the marginal, the marginalized within the group which is essentialized, especially women. Maybe the experience of being a woman is more important than the experience of being Asian. And if you work towards the identity of Asian woman as such, you also have to avoid to essentialize it. In other words, what we have seen today is a first sketch of what Asian theology is supposed to be. But what does it become when it meets with concrete situations, concrete questions, and concrete groups? This will be exactly the subject of our next lessons.